Into our next presentation, we are revisiting time, ancient timing techniques in modern practice. And introducing our fantastic speakers, we have Larry Arrington. Larry's work blends astrology, art, and dance, and you can find out more by going to patreon.com/Larry Arrington, and also at her website, which is astrologywithlarry.com. We also have Christopher Burick. Christopher is a practicing astrologer based in New York. He has studied Hellenistic astrology with Demetra George and is currently studying traditional natal astrology with Dr. Benjamin Dykes. His background in visual art informs his approach to astrology by bringing a deep engagement with mythology and symbolism into dialogue with the everyday. Next, we have Cameron Cassidy. Cameron is an astrologer and yoga teacher from Salem, Massachusetts. He's also an instructor for KeplerCollege, as well as the editor for the Cayley Review Astrological Journal. Centered in the ancient eyes of Babylonian and Egyptian astrology, Cameron blends old and new traditions, seeing where intersections create avenues for eye-opening awareness of the heavens and cosmic healing from the inside out. He is beyond excited to teach for KeplerCollege, and you can find Cameron's website at omegaastrology.com and also at the Instagram handle on the screen there. And also introducing Gabriel Rosas, a student of traditional astrologies for over 20 years. Gabe started with Robert Zola's medieval astrology course. He then became a pupil of Robert Schmidt at Project Hindsight. His practice of Hellenistic-era astrology seeks to bring the wisdom and worldview of antiquity to people living in the modern world. And you can find Gabe's website at gabrielrosasastrology.com. He is also on Twitter and Bluesky with the handles you can see on the screen. So I'm delighted to pass on the baton. I'm very much looking forward to the next presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm Larry. I'm delighted to be with you guys. So when we were sort of initially approached, with the sort of topic of Time Lords, this particular group, we kind of got together when we realized before we want to talk about the techniques of Time Lords, we wanted to talk a little bit more about theories of time, right? And sort of even how we think about time, if that makes sense. I know that in the sort of contemporary imagination, we tend to think of time as this, sort of undifferentiated arrow of forward motion that's even and universal. And if we sort of try to transpose that into Time Lords, it's not really an even fit. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So before we got into technique, we wanted to say, let's take a step back and think about, the cultural crucible of Hellenistic astrology and how time was conceived of in that period. And, if you even take a step further back from how they thought about time, right? They even thought about number very differently. We even know that sort of to the ancients, to the Hellenistics, there's an idea that the planets actually taught number, right? That there's this beautiful sort of correspondence to traditional cosmologies and even mathematics, right? We know that even the idea of math is so connected to astrology. So we kind of got together and we were like, okay, going through Plato and Aristotle and thinking about all these big things. And we had all these great quotes, like we have a Plato one that says, time is an eternal image moving according to number of eternity, remaining in unity. So you get all these beautiful sort of images of the multivalence of time. We have Aristotle saying time is not the number with which we count, but the number which is counted, right? Put that in your brain and turn it over a few times. It's so rich. And then when we met, the genius astrologer Gabe of the year of 2025 said, you guys, time is really weird. And so we wanted to start with that as a jumping off point. So dear Gabe, will you tell us what you meant when you said time is really weird?
Oh, yes. We have this sort of conception in our modern thinking that time is, featureless, effectless. It's essentially just a keeping device, counting device, measuring out when other forces act in, physical world. It's the time on the clock. It's the time where we decide how to do things, when to pay our taxes, when to collect unemployment or Social Security or what have you. we measure things out with it, but we don't. It doesn't really do anything. It's sort of just background, an accounting element. In the ancient world, however, time also had this very active, intentional quality. The word we're going to use is the Greek word kairos, as opposed to chronos, this sort of time timekeeping way of time. Kairos is more mystical. It's mysterious. It's the involvement of the gods or the spirits or the consciousness of the universe in our lives and throughout the cosmos. It isn't easily broken down into some sort of quantifiable way, but we have astrology, so we have a trick. It also doesn't move as we would expect time to move in a straight linear fashion from past to future with no exceptions. Kairotic time is much more dynamic and weird, again, to put it bluntly. But it also has meaning. It gives us, it helps see our purpose, gives us purpose. The things that we long for in life, these critical sort of moments. When we fall in love or get married or get this great job or undergo this terrible calamity. The meaningfulness of life time has meaning, time has purpose, time has intention, time is alive, just like everything else. And so through our devious astrological trick of Time Lords, we take our ability to measure out time through various means, and then we can see the meaning lying inherent within. And I believe Chris will have some discussion about that or some element regarding to that.
Yeah, well,
Or
yeah, I was just thinking about, this idea of what you're talking about, Gabe, with having, the planetary energies as not only an initial archetype to make that qualitative distinction off of in terms of talking about, good times versus bad times, but they also, like you said, give us the numerical outline to partition and segment time in a linear way. And so just as you were saying, the Time Lords like are able to bridge both of those together. And we have this great quote from Plato here who talks about how at the creation of the universe, these numbers were sort of sacredly distributed to all of the planetary spheres as they were being constructed. And so he says in the Timaeus, such was the mind and thought of God in the creation of time. The sun and moon and 5 other stars, which are called the planets, were created by him in order to distinguish and preserve the numbers of time. And that last line I think is so key here because this is the through line into where, Chris is going to talk about with planetary periods, and all of us will continue to branch off of these base numbers that create all of the systems with which we're able to both analyze kairotic and chronic time in these two different ways and bring them together.
It's also I always think of in the intersections of Kairos and Chronos, right? All of us who are consulting astrologers, people tend to come to us like longing for the kairotic. When will I fall in love? When will sort of the moment arrive when the thing actually happens? And this is such a beautiful way of thinking of the cosmologies, right? If we even think of those the sort of concentric circles of the spheres as holding the sort of weave of the chronocrators that can point to the arrival at Kairos. We talked about it yesterday when we were in our little group, but I was thinking about Kairos as like embodied time and the way that when you arrive at a kairotic moment, there's that like, oh, you feel it, right? I brought up the image of like the first time I saw my partner, right? That exists in my body as Kairos, not just sort of Chronos, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Larry, thank you for that beautiful image. It's really interesting to think about the ways that we can experience time, right? Um, uh, as a segue into that, a lot of people experience time through clock time or calendar time. And like we said, in a Chronos kind of way, people will count the days, count the hours, count the minutes, and we're sort of like just trying to get through that time. But I wanted to share another quote from Plato from the Timaeus to kind of bring in our astrological brain and to bring in the kairotic time. Thus, then, and for this reason, the night and day were created, being the period of the one most intelligent revolution. And the month is accomplished when the moon has completed her orbit and overtaken the sun, and the year when the sun has completed his own orbit. Mankind, with hardly an exception, have not remarked the periods of the other stars, and they have no name for them, and do not measure them against one another by the help of number. And hence they can scarcely be said to know that their wanderings, being infinite in number and admirable for their variety, make up time. So many ancient cultures had several different calendars that they were operating through. They would have a civil calendar and they would have religious calendars. So their solar calendar might be sort of like the more chronos based time events that society was um, used to kind of keep things marching forward. And then they would have lunar calendars that would be religious time, like Larry was mentioning, a more embodied experience of time in that way. And they were used to these various calendars overlapping and interweaving with each other so that time was very relational for them. It wasn't just the marching forward. And they had different scales of time. So in that way, we can sort of enter into this place of marrying Kairos and Chronos, and how we have these like regulated time, but we also have these moments of time. And then they start becoming one another.
Yeah, one of the primary things that we sort of arrived at, with what Chris is talking about with calendars is also changing our sort of thinking of time, not as just sort of time as singular, but times, right? So the two things that I hope everyone takes from this, I hope you all start saying kairotic. It's such a good word. And then thinking about times as opposed to just time. And when we're working with Time Lord systems, I think anybody who's started to study astrology knows that sort of you never arrive at like a single system, right? A single tool of measurement that is exactly right? We know that sort of when we're working in astrology, we're constantly collaging and overlapping all of these different kinds of techniques and different kinds of timing systems in order to sort of find the arrival at the kairotic. But I just wanted to sort of bridge our understanding of thinking about it, and perhaps in the ways that we already do, where we think of not just the time as like, in San Francisco 10:29, but the ways that we think about it as the times already. We think of, the different ways that astrology can tell time through the sun, right? The sort of rise and its set, or the sun and its annual dance. Through the year. We just had the sort of resetting of the astrological year with the Aries ingress, right? The lunation cycle, the way that it keeps the month. But there's all these other ways that I feel like in the astrological vernacular, we're starting to create a system of understanding the times, right? People think about Saturn returns quite a bit now. It's a common theme that you'll hear people bring up, those, kind of 30-year cycles. And even since 2020, if we look at sort of how conjunctional theory, right, this kind of very beautiful mundane practice from the Islamic Arabic period, people were talking about great conjunctions and those cycles, right? And we tend to sort of, it's interesting, we tend to think of real time as like 10:30 is the real time, but each of these are based on these beautiful phenomena, right? The sun, the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, but that they're all meant to be looked at in concert with one another, sort of this beautiful weave that they create in keeping the times, right? And then so with this, there's this great Schmidt quote that I wanted to bring in that speaks to the sort of weaving of the times. It says, in Greek astrological terms, then there are the times of Saturn and the times of Mars, etc., which are the unique times or numbers for the periodic motions of the planets, and which correspond to periods in which the native undergoes characteristic changes. These times may interweave and overlap in complicated ways. Rather than being pieces of some universal time, They make up time more as the fibers and strands of a rope make up the rope itself. So this beautiful weaving, which we've already started to see, you know, in the Julia Child example, this kind of beautiful overlap and interweaving.
Larry, that was great. I was like sparked by something that you said about the idea of there being one true time, like when is the real time? And as astrologers, we, start mucking about in timing techniques and come to find that it really is about all of the various times. And a lot of what we talked about in our discussions leading up to this was unifying these times and having something that will bring them all together.
Yeah, and I feel like that brings us back to that word you gave at the beginning, Larry, right? Chronocrator, literally meaning time ruler, and seeing that everything does have its own time, its own kairotic time. And the idea that we're talking about with overlapping things is that as you begin to learn more techniques of timing, which is our goal to help you as instructors in the Hellenistic Timing Certificate program, um, these Time Lords work as one, but also as many. And so there are simultaneously kind of parallel timelines. Sometimes they're interweaving with each other and overlapping. Sometimes they're kind of distinctly running together. And so there's a partnership that goes on where as you begin to layer and synthesize these approaches, we have to look at which strands of time are running independently, which ones are working together, and how are the relationships of the planets in the chart indicating whether these times are going to bring out, really synthetic and nice, organic manifestations of those planetary potentials, or whether these times are aggregating to be more, calamitous or challenging or difficult. There's a lot more to say, I guess, at least in terms of like the scope of that. I don't know if anyone else wants to hop in with like, in terms of the scales and transmission and stuff. I know there's a lot we can say and with some of these things, but
Well, Cam, that's great. Since you were talking about scope, it's the next thing on our list, obviously, but we can think about all of these timing techniques as ways to, pinpoint a piece of time. But as we start getting into the timing techniques, we start to realize that some of these techniques are really geared towards a much longer, broader period of time, and some of them are aimed at a more shorter period of time. And that sort of becomes a way to differentiate what we're actually looking for whenever we're doing an investigation through a particular timing technique. So something like Nadia beautifully illustrated circumambulations for us, and that's a whole life. And Larry's going to be talking to us later about Zodiacal releasing, and similarly, that's a very long period of time. So other timing techniques are much shorter time periods and they can kind of fine tune things for us, but it really is about sort of bringing those two things into relation to one another. And we start to see through that the Time Lords, the Lords of the Times, have a lot of interactions at many levels. I'll let somebody else jump in with the dump down the rabbit hole of rabbit holes with fractal time and how bigger things become smaller things that look just like the bigger things.
Fractals. I mean, I think that may be Cameron's wheelhouse, but if I was going to throw in my opinion, again, we're dealing with many various cycles, obviously, with various periods of time of different lengths, often repeating themes, of particular planets or particular places in the chart or particular lots. And it's what is an event? An event, we think of like a wedding. Say, okay, when the couple says "I do," and okay, they're married now. But that's just like one key moment in a long, almost a festival of various events. Whenever they first met, whenever they first actually went on a date, whenever they first thought, whatever level of seriousness they determined the relationship to be at, to the point where like, oh, let's actually get married and let it eat it up. This whole long thing. And even the I do is not really the end. It's sort of, again, it's like a climactic point that goes on and on until, death do us part, basically. So an event isn't just one discrete moment in time. It's a whole bunch of various convoluted moments. And with the idea of time being weird, you see all these different things happening in various scales and points of focus all throughout the life.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's so beautiful about the quotes that we chose. Each of them has some, well, not each, but several of them have some component of the eternal in them, right? That the eternal is always a component of time, right? Just in the way that, when we look at this very beautiful slide with all of so full of information, right? When we look at the why Time Lord symbolic versus real, where that came from was in Dr. Benjamin Dyke's introduction to Abu Mashar's On the Revolutions. There's this really great way of looking at the tripartite system of timing that's necessary to find that moment of marriage or whatever it is. And that the natal chart has this kind of eternal quality. It exists outside sort of measured or numeric time. The natal chart is timeless. The Time Lord systems become the symbolic. And then we need these triggers of real time, either, through returns or through transits, it's kind of very overused technique to ground us in the sort of the moment of Kairos. But I love thinking about what you're saying, Gabe, as like, the eternal, the idea of the eternal or the timeless, it obliterates all of our ideas of quantified time, right? Like it's like in that instant, it all explodes. So
Yeah, and it's like from there we have that natal moment that on the bottom right side of the screen you see generates immediately from that first breath all of these interconnected ways of analyzing how to look at this person's evolution through time. And Chris, who will talk to us about planetary periods shortly, and like we were saying at the beginning, these periods are going to be the base archetypal numerical values that give us all of the following pieces of information, along with the ascensional times of the signs. And so those stand alone as their own initial values that allow everything else to work the way that it does. And so in that way, you can see that it sort of begins there, and the arrows kind of take us down through the alternate systems that were developed, where we have like Ptolemy, who used this lovely method called the Ages of Man that was sort of a broader concept in the cultural worldview of the ancients, that over the course of a human lifetime, we're actually ascending through the planetary spheres, and at particular ages in time, according to the planetary periods, evolve and go up from the moon, eventually towards Saturn. And then after that, Ptolemy used the circumambulations of the places of life, the vital places, like Nadia was saying. There are several different areas that were used. And then Ptolemy last used profections, after that with transits. Now, the reason circumambulations has this kind of other arrow is because Robert Schmidt also had this hypothesis that brought together these different timing systems that were used particularly by Vettius Valens, as you see written on the top right of that area, whereby all of the releasing candidates for circumambulations had their own individual methods, namely zodiacal releasing with the lots of fortune and spirit, decennials with the sun and moon, and the quarters of the moon with the prenatal syzygy. And so this was a model he kind of developed to see how all of these techniques are interrelated and were practiced synthetically by Valens and lots of other astrologers that use different combinations of these methods.
Pam, thank you so much for this diagram. I feel like it is a great way to visually represent what's going on here. It makes me think a little bit too about something Larry was saying with transits and how that becomes a specific moment. And, we're sort of always like waiting for the transit to hit, right? But also in your broader context of the various timing techniques, both of these things are about filtration, right? About understanding when things become useful. So for something like transits, we have other timing techniques that we can look to see when those transits are more important for a person. But like you were saying, even the timing techniques themselves kind of become useful tools for each other and become interrelated to one another. And that gives us, yeah, this like the fractals are coming back and the filtration is there and the idea of synthesis. So these things sort of all lead into themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like you'll just see that quote of like, you have to confirm things, seeing it 3 or 4 times on multiple systems to be sure. Did anyone want to mention also handing over before we move on?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the sort of main techniques of all these Time Lord systems is the handing over or the flowing forth of responsibilities, depending on when things change, when either from one greater period to another, where one planet or sign or whatever hands over to another planet its responsibilities for life in this particular period of time, and how that changes. And then you get into the nuance of like how those planets relate in the natal chart, and then we can start to like get more into the nitty gritty. But even in general, through the natures, planets going from benefics to malefics are usually a sign of problems ahead, and the reverse being the reverse. But also within these larger periods of time that Time Lords tend to deal with, there are smaller parts where there's also sort of handing over, but it's almost like a passing down, where the larger planetary ruler of the period still asserts its control over things, but now the more direct management of time in that period now handed over to some other planet. Usually goes through the sequence of all of them, depending on how the system is configured for this particular practice. So that's more of a, there's the relationship of a hierarchical sort of passing of responsibilities, and then this sort of horizontal sharing of responsibilities between a group of semi-equals passing through periods of time.
That's great, Gabe. It reminds me of this Schmidt idea of dyadic counting, the idea that, like we're saying, maybe one Time Lord is responsible for the times, but then gives these times over to another planet to then distribute the times. And so we have this interrelatedness that, what does it look like when Mars hands over his times to Saturn versus what does it look like when Saturn hands over his time to Mars? They're quite different. And the ancients have a lot of opinions about which combinations are better or worse or more neutral.
And this is also a way we can exemplify when you bring up the monadic and dyadic time, the idea of form and matter. Here we have the Greek eidos and hule. We can actually relate this to all these Time Lord systems and transits at the same time. I remember this when we were planning this out. I had a nice line that was like, transits have the veneer of being real because they exist. I mean, we can see them. We can go outside, you can see the planets in the sky move around. They're apprehensible through the senses. But in a lot of the philosophical schools of this period, the Platonists and the Stoics, the sensible world is the least real world. It's because the senses can be fooled. Senses are not secure ways of achieving knowledge, wisdom. That is left to the intellectual world, the world of the mind, basically. And so these symbolic procedures, these Time Lord procedures, dealing with all various kinds of symbolic time that's not actually occurring in a chronological way, in a sort of timekeeping calendar way necessarily. These hold the meaning and the impulse to creation and how things develop, and the matter, the base matter that a transit sort of fits in this sort of scheme. That's basically just ticking things off. Something already has to be set up, something already has to be established, and the transits are more sparks to like the kindling in terms of like getting things to happen or making things manifest in the world.
Yeah, and like we'll see good examples too of how that can translate for. I love that analogy too of like transits versus symbolic timing systems, but it also can play out within one timing system on its own, where you have like a level one, or a more global ruler that basically can create the form, and the archetype of what can happen there. And then within its own subperiods, you get the matter of when that's translated to another planet, what can it actually create physically from the archetype that's given to it in a more archetypal sense, right? By the level one, or the eidolon, the form of the level one ruler.
Okay, so we're getting into the times of Etta James. I'll start off with ascensional times and planetary periods, and then I'll hand it over to Larry for some zodiacal releasing. And then Cam will talk to us about decennials, and Gabe will wrap it up with profections. So, ascensional times of the signs and planetary periods. We'll start off with the planetary periods. So, we'll look specifically at minor years, but the idea here is that all celestial bodies have a cyclical motion relative to the sun. So there's different kinds of planetary periods, but we are today going to be really specifically honing in on synodic recurrence periods, and that's the average time it takes a planet to conjoin with the sun at the same zodiacal degree it did previously. You can see here on the right, we have Venus's various periods. I'm sure at this point in the Venus retrograde, today it's Cazimi. You've all heard about Venus's various times. So as a timing technique, the minor years are a combination of the tropical period and the synodic recurrence period. So a planet conjoining the sun and returning to the same zodiacal degree. Over here on the right, you can see all the minor years of the planets. So as a timing technique, this is symbolic time. We're going to take 1 year for another year. So part of this is there's no ordinal numbers. You might be familiar with this if you have ever practiced profections. So 8 years is age 7. Year 1 begins at birth and goes to the first birthday. Year 2 begins at the first birthday and ends at the second birthday. As a planet completed, sorry, as a planet is completing its minor years, so in the year leading up to the completion, the topics of the planet become realized in the life. So Valens in book 7 really goes into these planetary periods and then ascensional times. I didn't quote him here, but I hope that this is condensed enough for everyone. So on the left, we have some visual representations of the synodic recurrence periods over different periods of time. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Venus's very even and perfect pentagon. This is something that Venus is known for. And if you compare it with the Mercury and Mars synodic recurrence cycles, you see that they have a lot more inconsistencies, we'll say, than the Venus period. This is from the lovely book Tables of Planetary Phenomena by Neil Michelson. So for Etta James, we're going to look at the planetary period of Venus. So that's 8 years. She was born January 25th, 1938, and then we'll add 8 years and come to January 1946. So this will be the completion date of the Venus years. So there's a little bit of this is like the orb situation. Everyone has their feelings about orbs. And so the idea of exactly when these events will come to pass in the life everyone has a little bit of a different take. Valens says that it is in the year leading up to the completion of the years is when these happen. I've learned this technique from Demetra George, and she gives a little bit of a broader leeway on either side of the completion date for things to come about. So that's a choose your own adventure, but I just wanted to mention that as we're working through these techniques, people are starting to come to their own conclusions, and hopefully you'll start working with this and find out more for yourself. So in interpreting this, we want to think about Venus's natural significations, and she's naturally associated with the arts and music. So it's hard to get particular biographical information for people, especially at such a young age. And often you'll see that if you do get some information about someone at a younger age, it might be that the kinds of events that happen actually happen in the world around them. So, right, Venus is often partnerships. So if you see a Venus activation during this like period of the minor years, it might actually be that the person's parents have some sort of issue in their relationship. So it might be an externalized events. So during this time, I don't have anything specific, but the best that I could find is that Etta James begins singing in a church choir at age 5, but she's physically abused by the director. He claims that it was an effort to get her to sing from her stomach, not from her chest. So what I will say is that this is sort of a formative experience for her as a performer, but also in finding her own voice. So she becomes well known at church for her ability to sing, and then soon after her foster father, begins waking her up in the middle of the night to come and sing for some as entertainment for some of his house guests, and then begins threatening her. So this is obviously very tumultuous, formative experience for her, especially around singing. But we'll see later on that Venus really becomes this thing where a lot of her singing career gets tied up in it. Okay, so the other part of this timing technique is the ascensional times of the signs. So depending on someone's location on the surface of the Earth, the signs of the zodiac take a particular amount of time to completely rise over the eastern horizon. So we're going to talk a little bit about coordinate systems. If this gets really too much for you and too dense, there will be recap slides. If you're watching the recording, just pause, take a look. But I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. So the thing that's really important here is that the equator is the midpoint between the north and south poles, so that the poles are 90 degrees away from the equator. We're looking on the left image at the grid of latitude and longitude that I'm sure most people are familiar with. It's a way for us to find a point on the surface of the Earth. In the right diagram, what we can do is if we're on the surface of the Earth, we can actually project that grid out into the sky. And when we do that, longitude becomes right ascension and latitude becomes declination. So I'm going to take this image on the right and flip it. And that gives us the view here from Stellarium. So we're here at the equator. We see that the equator runs straight up, perpendicular. And these are lines to measure the right ascension. So right ascension is measured in hours, but it can also be measured in degrees. So there's 24 hours of right ascension or 360 degrees of right ascension. So as these lines of right ascension rise over the eastern horizon, they do so equally, right? And then as they crest overhead or culminate overhead, they also do so evenly or equally. So the equator is perpendicular or a right angle to the meridian. So that's how we get this, that's how we get the name right ascensions. So as a quick recap for the meridian, most of us know it as the midheaven. It connects the North Pole and the South Pole, and it divides the globe into eastern and western hemispheres. So as points rise over the eastern horizon, they move up toward the meridian and culminate, and then they begin declining westward. So at the equator, we're still here. I've added in the ecliptic, right? So this is the zodiacal band. And you see that the ecliptic and the equator they're not parallel, they're not perpendicular. They have this oblique relationship to each other. So they're at an angle. This is called the obliquity of the ecliptic. And right now it's about 23.44 degrees. And we know that because the poles are at an angle, that as the Earth moves around the sun, the different parts of the Earth are closer to the sun. So this gives us the seasons, right? Okay, so here at the ecliptic, I have 180 degrees of absolute longitude. This is 0 degrees Libra. And we see that over this 4-hour period of time, that about 4 hours of right ascension have come up over the eastern horizon and also culminated overhead at the local meridian. And we see that the about 60 degrees of zodiacal longitude have also come up over the eastern horizon. So at the equator, as 4 hours of clock time has passed, 4 hours of right ascension have also passed. 1 hour of right ascension is equal to 15 degrees of right ascension. So about 60 degrees of the ecliptic passed over the eastern horizon as exactly 60 degrees of right ascension passed over the local meridian. So at the equator, it takes signs of about-ish. For our purposes today, about 2 hours to rise. But we don't all live on the equator. Most of us live in other places. So I've taken us to 40 degrees north of the equator. And you can see here we have 0 Libra again coming over the eastern horizon. And 4 hours later, we only get to about 230 degrees or 20 degrees of Scorpio. So we've changed our relationship to the equator, and that changes our relationship to the ecliptic. So at 40 degrees north latitude, about-ish 50 degrees of the ecliptic has passed over the eastern horizon, as exactly 60 degrees of right ascension have passed over the local meridian. So due to the obliquity, there are signs that rise slower or faster because of their angle in relationship to the horizon. So there are signs of short or crooked ascension and signs of long or straight ascension. In the northern hemisphere, long ascension signs are Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius. And the short ascension signs are Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini. And then obviously this is switched for the southern hemisphere. So we looked at from Libra to Sagittarius coming up over the eastern horizon at 40 degrees, and we saw that it was even shorter than the 60 degrees that we were maybe expecting. Okay, so how do we use this as a timing technique? I took these ascensional times from AstroSeek. So if you choose the traditional chart calculator and then scroll down a bit, you'll find the rising times. And then also here's a chart that I generated with Delphic Oracle that'll give you the ascensional times in the center of the chart. So again, we're talking about symbolic time. We're using 1 degree of right ascension is 1 year of life, ordinal numbers. And so once a sign has completed its ascension over the horizon, the planets in that sign and the topics of the whole sign house become realized in life. Okay, over here on the right, we have the ascensional times that are particular to Etta James. So the ascensional time of Aquarius at 34 degrees and 3 minutes north, where she was born, is 23.43 years. So here's the math on that. So again, 1 year leading up to the completion date, the events of the sign will manifest in the life. So our date range for this is mid-1960 to mid-1961. We're talking about the 5th place, which is called good fortune, and it's associated with creativity and pleasure. So Etta James releases her album At Last in late 1960, and then the title track is released as a single in early 1961. The first line of this song is, "At last, my love has come along." So this song really is about, it's a love song, right? About finding great joy in being with a lover. And then obviously we all know that her rendition of this song is like the best known version out there. Okay, so that seemed really simple, right? So now we're going to actually take the sum of the planet's period and the ascensional time of the sign, and that's going to produce we'll be able to track even more events in the life. So we'll take the planetary period of Venus and the ascensional times of Aquarius and add those together. That'll give us mid-1968 to 1969. So we know that Venus is a natural significator of partnerships, and the 5th place is associated with children. So during this time, Etta gives birth to her first son, and she also marries this man, Artis Mills. Okay, so ascensional times and planetary periods seem pretty simple, but they actually can become very complex. So this is just the beginning. There's a more complete treatment that includes the planet's condition, its domicile lords, more subdividing of the times. And it's interesting to think about this as like a very simple but powerful technique that gives an archetypal outline of the life, right? Everybody born at a certain latitude is going to experience time in a certain way. So there are some implications of like universal times for everyone. But I will say that this is one of those techniques that really does kind of its best work in relation to other timing techniques. They allow us to bring in a little bit more nuance and have some more integrated understanding. So for that, I will hand you over to the lovely Larry Arrington.
Thank you, Chris. That was so wonderful. You are an expert at explaining right ascension. Very complicated material, very, very easy to follow. Thank you. So I am going to take us into territory of zodiacal releasing, but I do really want to say the thrust of how I'm going to talk about zodiacal releasing is with an eye towards this continued conversation about how in the Hellenistic kind of cultural crucible, they're thinking about time, right? The temporal foundation of zodiacal releasing is really sort of the aim. And what I want to say is we don't have to agree with any of these worldviews, right? I think as students of traditional astrology and all of its different permutations, we first want to sort of acquaint ourselves with what that worldview is, or sort of what that kind of cultural moment is, before we go into sort of our opinions on it. So I just want to kind of put that as a little disclaimer. Chris, will you go to our next slide? And so for me, when I'm thinking about zodiacal releasing specifically, what we said in the beginning of our talk about how the Time Lords really speak to this intersection of Kairos and Chronos. Zodiacal releasing really, really does that, in my opinion. What I'll say, just sort of basically, in the basics of sort of introducing the technique, is that this technique is based on those minor years that Chris just taught us, right? That the synodic recurrence of each of these planets, right? That number is preserved as this very special entity of time. And so what I wanted to, this is very cute. I'm going to have some very cute little things in my presentation. I hope you don't mind that I'm bringing some cheese. But when we were talking about doing Etta James, I loved that At Last was like her most famous song, her big album that she produced, because just that phrase, at last, right? It sort of expresses Kairos in a way, right? This arrival at a moment. And Aristotle has this great quote on time where it says, time is the number of emotion with respect to before and after, right? We kind of get that as this beautiful articulation of Kairos. So this slide, just the basics of zodiacal releasing, it connects us back to those planetary periods, specifically the minor years. We know that those minor years are based on the synodic recurrence cycle. As Chris said, Venus is retrograde. I'm sure you all are tired of hearing about the 8 years of Venus at this point. And that zodiacal releasing, it releases each of those planets, right? This phrase of releasing, which I believe comes from Schmidt as the name of this technique. But what I like about it is releasing implies that something that was previously bound is let go, right? All of a sudden we're in a place where it's like, okay, Venus, do your thing, or okay, Mercury, do your thing, or okay, Saturn, do your thing. And that, when we think about that, there's a way that I'm like, okay, at last is kind of the perfect example. So we're going to dig into that as we go through. Now, when we're talking about time, zodiacal releasing is interesting and different from the other Time Lord systems in that it uses like ground zero of the technique. The organizing principle of the technique is the lot of fortune, right? And, I don't think there's any other technique that so expressly connects us to the lot of fortune as like the center of how we organize. And what can be interesting to the sort of modern imagination when we interact with ZR, or the lot of fortune, is that it puts us face to face with this kind of cultural context of fortune, of 2K, and daimon, right? Spirit, these very important kind of these very important principles to Hellenistic culture. And when we're in that terrain and we're talking about time, fortune, unlike other points, is going to make us sit with some notion of fate or predeterminism or destiny. So that's kind of our first big temporal layer, that we're in the realm of destiny here. We're in the realm of predeterminism. So Chris, will you switch my slide for me, Liv? So I wanted to just bring up this image. If we think about what that Schmidt quote that we looked at in the beginning, he said, "These times may interweave and overlap in complicated ways. Rather than being pieces of some universal time, they make up time more as the fibers and strands of a rope make up the rope itself." I thought this was such a beautiful thing to weave into the beginnings of our conversation about fortune. And so I'm going to take this idea of the rope and bring it into Plato's Republic. This quote says, "So saying, the prophet scattered lots indifferently among them all, and each of them took up the lot which fell near him. Now, when all the souls had chosen their lives, they approached Lachesis in the order the lottery had assigned them, and she sent with them the daimon whom they had chosen to be the guardian of their lives and the fulfiller of the choice. The daimon led the souls first to Clotho and drew them within the revolution of the spindle, impelled by her hand, thus ratifying the destiny of each. And then, when they were fastened to this, carried them to Atropos, who spun the threads and made them irreversible, whence, without turning round, they passed beneath the throne of necessity." So y'all will maybe recognize this as Myth of talking about the fates and that beautiful thread that is each of our lives, right? And I thought of, what if we take Schmidt's image of the rope with all the tangles of the times, weaving together, and thought of that as our sort of fated, our moment with the fates. Chris, will you switch the slide for me, love? Great. So here we have an image of that thread, right? We can imagine if we zoomed in on that thread, we could see, there are the Saturn years or the Mercury years or the moon years or whatnot. Will you skip to the next one? Thank you. So when we're looking at Etta James, right, and we're going to think about her chart in zodiacal releasing relative to the lot of fortune, we want to understand first what the lot of fortune is, right? The lot of fortune is going to speak to, just as we saw in that Myth of quote, the context that someone is born into, right? The sort of the body, the resource, the family, the genethological, right? How we are already placed in time, right? Fortune really speaks to that. And Valens in particular, who is our main source for zodiacal releasing, really, really, really asks us to consider the chart through the lens of fortune, right? This is a quote from Anthology 218, where Valens is basically telling us, right, the lot of fortune is equivalent to the ascendant. We can look at the chart as a derived, intact chart where we put fortune first, and everything everything maintains its integrity via that derived chart. I think I'll just read this little part here where it says, "That is, the lot itself will possess the power of the horoscopos, that of life, the 10th zodion from this, the power of the midheaven, that of reputation, the 7th, the power of the descendant, the 4th, the subterranean zodion, and the remaining places will possess the power of the 12 regions. For some have mystically established the universal horoscopus and its squares to be the cosmic pivot points, but the lot and its squares to be the genethological pivot points." So such a rich excerpt that's really telling us that the lot of fortune, right, the chart as expressed by the lot of fortune is equivalent to the sort of natal chart as we're used to it. So if we look at Etta James's chart, you can see that she has fortune in Sagittarius in the 3rd place. It's with the moon. Will you skip us to the next slide, Chris? Great. And what we're going to look at in this at last period is releasing daimon, which is what we'll do when we're in consideration of what sort of one does with their beautiful life through the years of Mercury. And let me read you one more quote from Valens. This is in book 4, which is where we're in the terrain of zodiacal releasing. It says, "And when the division takes place upon the horoscopus and upon the midheaven and upon the remaining pivots, it will produce reputation, but not in the same way, for the places square to the lots are more energetic. So I wanted to bring this in because it lets us know, it really connects us back to that first quote about how the chart relative to the lot of fortune has something to say about how fate sort of expresses itself in the life. You know, many of you will use the word peak period, which is what we say when we're talking about the places that are angular to fortune. But this quote is really getting into it with this word energetic. And energetic, right, we can sort of think about it through the lens of like, right, energy, I can get up and do stuff and, you know, the sort of will to move. But if we think about it from a traditional lexicon, it's going to speak more to sort of the will of the divine or the will of God or what is fated. And so there's a way where we might think that zodiacal releasing is giving us this kind of fated picture. So Chris, will you switch to the next slide? Okay, so minor years of Mercury. We're going to look at her her period where she is 10th from fortune, which according to Valens would be one of the most important periods, right? We would say that if fortune is in Sagittarius, Virgo is the 10th place. Virgo's lord is Mercury, so we are in Mercury's times. Now, what's interesting in her Virgo period is we can see that Virgo, while it is 10th from fortune, it's 12th natally. So what we're going to see is in this period of time, in this weave of the times, we're really getting 12th place and 10th place things that are happening. If we look very generally at the at Virgo and at Virgo's lord Mercury, we see a mixture of condition, right? Virgo rather is opposed by Mars, which we know adds some challenge. And we also can see that Mercury, right? It's dynamically angular. You'll see how it's down there in Capricorn, on the verge of meeting the IC, and rules the 10th place from fortune. You know, it's visible, it's direct, all that good stuff. Some stuff's gonna happen when Mercury is activated. But we can also see that Mercury is square to Saturn. So we switch us to the next slide, please. Okay, so in this period, right, we are 10th from fortune, 12th natally. Let's just look at this collection of things that happen in this period of time. She has the very, very, very sad situation of becoming addicted to heroin by the age of 21, right? So 1959. She signs a contract with Chess Records, 1960. We have a 10th from fortune thing there. 1960, At Last is released. We have a 10th from fortune. 1966, she's arrested for writing bad checks. We have a 12th house incarceration or legal trouble. 1967, she releases Tell Mama with I'd Rather Go Blind as a B-side, a very 10th from fortune thing. 71, her husband is incarcerated for heroin possession. We see that Mars being 7th from, we see that 12th house condition. In 73, she is arrested, so we get another 12th house thing. And then in 73, her self-titled album is nominated for a Grammy. And then in 74, as we're ending this period, she goes into drug treatment, which helps. It doesn't, you know, solve the problem, but we see that there's a loosening of the bond in the period, and this supports. So we go to our next slide, please, Chris. Great. So if we're just going to add those two Valens things about the sort of energios or the most potent places, they are listed as 1st and 10th from fortune. So if we dig into that sort of the fractal of zodiacal releasing, we see that within the 10th from fortune period, as she arrives at the 1st from fortune period, 1960, April of 1960 to April of 1961, this is when At Last is released, right? We can sort of see that inside this larger period that contains the sort of 10th from fortune story, as it sort of moves across 2.5 decades, the year where we're at 1st from fortune is when At Last is released. And of course, we all know At Last, but it's worth saying that that album is also peppered with some of her most well-known songs, A Sunday Kind of Love, At Last, and I Just Want to Make Love to You. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is my other little cheesy thing. I love, you know, in that song, thinking about the kairotic of At Last, My Love Has Come Along. The lyrics continue, my lonely days are over and life is like a song. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the traditional cosmologies and the fates, you'll know that the fates are positioned, right, and creating this beautiful music of the spheres, the kind of the beautiful cosmic harmony. And so this quote from the Republic as well said, "These are the fates, daughters of necessity, who are clothed in white robes and have chaplets upon their heads, Lachesis and Clotho and Atropos, who accompany with their voices the harmony of the sirens, Lachesis singing of the past, Clotho of the present, Atropos of the future." So I just thought it was such a sweet little example of these two, kind of flanking lyrics. At last, my love has come along, and life is like a song. Will you switch to our next slide, please, Chris? Great. And then we'll just do one more quick little look at this. This is like the fastest covering of Zodiacal releasing ever. If we're adding in more level 2s, if we're adding in more of this sort of fractal spiraling in that Zodiacal releasing does, I wanted to look at when she goes to the period which is first from fortune, which we know is our 10th from fortune and first from fortune are considered very, very important. This one goes from March of 1999 to January of 2011. In the L2, we're in the Aquarius period, which is May 2002 to November of 2004. And I just wanted to add this in because there's so many fascinating components to the Aquarius stellium in her chart. It is, if we think about it, especially through the lens of Valens, right? There's so much inside that house. She has the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter there. Jupiter is the Lord of Fortune. It's the first triplicity Lord of her sect light. The Sun is the Lord of Daimon. It's the second triplicity Lord of the sect light. And Venus is her ascendant Lord and the benefic of sect. And so what happens in this period? She gets a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, which all of these, the Jupiter, Sun, Venus, the triplicity lords, the Lord of Fortune, the Lord of Daimon, those are all the things that Valens says, look for those for relative eminence, right? Look at those to tell you how big of a star will this star be. And we see that this lifetime achievement comes when we arrive at that place. So Chris, will you switch to the next slide? Great. So that was an absolute race through Zodiacal releasing with the beautifully kairotic phrase of "at last" as our compass that we moved towards. So Cam, take us away, love.
Yes, thank you, and amazing job. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing well. I know we are just getting blessed to follow one after another. I'm just feeling so grateful and amazed to be a part of this awesome lineup. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you all now about Decennials. So this is sort of an interesting like sister to Zodiacal releasing. As we looked at earlier in the slide about Time Lords, the major difference we're going to see here is instead of releasing through the signs, we're releasing through the planets here. And this is one of the oldest Time Lord methods that we are aware of. It's attributed to some of the ancient Egyptians by Hephaestion of Thebes. And our earliest source of the technique textually is from Chrysosthemis, who was in the 2nd century BCE. And it was used by a handful of astrologers, Chrysosthemis, Valens, Firmicus, and Hephaestion. And these techniques were used continuously, even into the medieval and Renaissance periods. We find through different papyri and other manuscripts that were using this method. Next slide, please. And so what we're going to do here, in contrast to ZR, or Zodiacal releasing, where we're using the planetary periods in years, the difference here is that we're going to use the same values of the planets in months. So what happens is each planet will contribute its planetary period in months. And when we add them all up together, the 30 months of Saturn, the 12 of Jupiter, the 15 of Mars, the 19 from the Sun, 8 for Venus, the 20 from Mercury, and the 25 from the Moon, that totals to 129. This is like the sacred number you want to have like tattooed on your wrist. Okay, 129 is the number that is going to basically encode all of the decennial releasing sequences. And so when we put them together in months, that means that we are defining one planetary decade as 129 months. And that equals 10 years and 9 months, right? So 120 months is 10 years plus 9 more months is 129 months. And you can move to the next slide. So the idea here is that we're going to move through the sequence of planets in the chart, assigning each one 10 years and 9 months. And then, of course, we have the question, which Nadia talked earlier about, where do we start from, right? So the simple approach, which is advocated for by Firmicus, is very plain and very easy, and it works. We use the sun by day and the moon by night. Other authors have also given additional rules for choosing the releaser. I'm not going to get into that now. There are cases where that can be more evident and more useful in the releasing, but generally, this was what Firmicus did, and it works pretty well. So he says, and so if the sun were the lord of the times, he holds the rulership for 10 years, 9 months. And in a similar way, if the moon were the lord of time, she will hold on to it for 10 years and 9 months. And so in a diurnal nativity, the sun takes on the first decennial, the second, the one in the nativity, which was found in the following place, the third one, the one which was after the second one. And so what he's beginning to describe here in the second part of this quote, and you can move to the next slide, is actually the order of which we're going to generate the periods. And this is done through the sequence of the planets as they fall uniquely in the natal horoscope. So we're going to start with that releaser that we choose. So in this case, we're going to look at the moon. And from there, we will follow through zodiacal order like ZR of moving in the sequence of signs, right? Except we're looking at the planets. So after the moon, the next planet to rise, or the next planet we will encounter, is Mercury in Capricorn. Then after Mercury, we have Venus, and then the sun, and then Jupiter, and then Mars, and then Saturn. So what we have here is a extremely individualized and unique releasing sequence, because there are thousands of different permutations of the ways the planets will align one after the other. So basically, the reason this technique is really cool is because you get that individuality for every single chart you look at, and it's going to be particular to each individual person. And next slide. So basically what we're going to look at here is the planet that begins the 10-year and 9-month sequence will be called the level 1 or decade lord. After that, it's going to hand off its rulership, right? It's going to distribute its power to the level 2 rulers, or the monthly lords. So this is called a distribution. And this was what we were talking about earlier with that form and matter, right? This idea of this level 1 ruler has this overall agenda that it's going to try to accomplish it, which is shaped more specifically by the level 2 rulers into some particular matter. And so how the language we use with that is, for example, her first decade sequence will be ruled by the moon on level 1 for 10 years and 9 months. Then the moon will distribute to itself for the first 25 months of that 10-year, 9-month period. So the level 1 and level 2 rulers are both moon and moon for the first period of this 10-year period. Then it will be moon Mercury for 20 months. Then it will be moon Venus for 8 months, and then moon Sun for 19 months. And that will total to 129 months. After that period, then we move to Mercury, who then will rule for 10 years and 9 months, having that decade, and we move again through the order on level 2. So could you bring us to the next slide, Chris? Now we're going to look at these decades in her life. So, like we already said, we know she has a nocturnal horoscope, so we're going to start with the moon. And in her first decade, next slide, please. We're looking at here basically age 0 to 10, right? The first 10 years of everyone's life are going to be in this first planetary decade. And the moon here is taking out the first 25 months of her life, then moon Mercury until she's about 2, February 1940, Mercury takes over. Then October 6th, 1941, Venus has the rulership for 8 months. So that's the cadence here. And one period I wanted to highlight here was during the moon sun period. Hephaestion of Thebes gives us, actually all of the astrologers I mentioned at the beginning give descriptions for each of these level 1 and level 2 period combinations. So there's 49 different kinds you could be under at any given time. And Hephaestion says that in these times, when the moon transmits or distributes its power to the sun, the natives are helped by their relatives after having first been thrown into confusion. And so it was at this age of 5 that she was brought into the care of her grandparents after her mother, who was 19 years old at that time. So her mom was 14 when she was born. Her mother relinquished care of her. She was taken in by her grandparents. She started singing at her church, and she started getting her vocal lessons like Chris was talking about, which also led to some other more difficult situations. But as we see here, we really get that description of the sun and moon coming in. And it also makes sense with the sun and moon as the rulers of the 10th and the 11th house, right? The 11th house in the sense of her community that she was, amidst at her church, but also her 10th house as she was, getting the spotlight as a singer, right? And so we can also layer in these additional descriptions beyond the natures of the two planets by looking specifically at what the planets are doing in the horoscope. So in the next decade, that's Mercury. And as soon as this decade began, so in the Mercury period, she moved to Los Angeles, right? So we see Mercury in the 4th house. So that brought her to move. Then in the Mercury-Venus level 2 period, she made a trio group with 2 of her girlfriends. They started singing and writing music together. And Hephaestion says when Mercury transmits to Venus in the Decennials, it causes beneficence from friends, the cessations of evils, and they will be in love with things connected with music and dance, right? So that makes a lot of sense here. Then it transmitted to the sun in 1950, but it was in 1952 when Mercury transmitted to Jupiter that she wrote in her autobiography that she felt her childhood was over. She began her professional recording career at age 15 when Mercury transmitted to Jupiter. And Hephaestion says, when Mercury transmits to Jupiter by night, it signifies efficacious times. It will cause acquisition, profits, the destruction of enemies, business in the marketplace, and advancements through writing and speaking, right? And so we see how at a young age, she was brought into a planetary period that was really positive for her career to essentially soar. And then at the Mercury-Saturn period, this was actually where drug use began to enter into her reality, her world. She wrote that in this time, she saw things that young people shouldn't be seeing about, the things that go on in the music and the professional recording industry. And also a song of hers that she recorded the year prior was covered by Georgia Gibbs, and the cover rose to #1 on the charts nationally immediately. And Hephaestion says when Mercury transmits to Saturn, it's the dismantling of ancient things, right? And so her song previously was kind of turned over by this cover recording. And criticisms for secret deeds, the diseases and dangers, charges concerning more recent dealings, right? So this actually brought about a more negative interaction with the music industry and with her career. And then we move to the next decade, which was ruled by Venus. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually going to look at the transits as well. So Critodema says you can look at the transits to the nativity at the time the chronometers shift. And what we see here, this is the chart of the transits for when her Mercury decade began. And so this chart is going to give us more specific indications about what will happen during the entire period from between ages roughly 10 and 20. And we see there was an exact Moon-Venus conjunction in Cancer in her 10th house for this decade chart, right? And again, it's like this is the decade that she felt her career was solidified and she kind of lost her childhood to a major extent, right? And then, we see Jupiter's in Sagittarius, right? All of these themes are going to stick with her for those 10 years. And we can move ahead. There we go. Yeah, so for the Venus decade, notice how she has both of the benefics under the beams of the sun. So there's a lot of hidden activity that's happening in relationship to the activities of Venus and Jupiter. So when Venus period began, this was when her heroin addiction began at age 21. And again, we see Venus as the ruler of her ascendant, hidden under the beams of the sun in the 5th house of, in this case, perhaps excessive or damaging pursuits of, pleasure, right, with her drug addiction. When Venus transmitted to the sun, Hephaestion says in relation to actions, it's good and profitable. And indeed it was. That was when she signed with Chess Records. It was her rise to fame. That was when she released the song, If I Can't Have You. And that contract stayed until the sun transmitted to Saturn. So we see the sun coming in as this gift of her opportunity to be signed with a record label. And the sun's the lord of her 11th house. And I won't get into it, but the non-reversal lot of fortune ends up in the 11th house of Leo. So in any case, the sun brought in that opportunity that then in the next decade, when the sun gave to Saturn, it was basically her contract ended, and we'll see that in the next decade. And then Venus gave over to Jupiter right after that, and that was at last. And so, oh, could you actually just go back one? Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so it was when Venus transmitted to Jupiter that at last had its major success. Firmicus says in Decennials, when Venus gives to Jupiter, if Jupiter took up the time and assigned to him by Venus, it decrees a good and happy time, but he will think about certain infamous things. And so again, amid her rides to fame here, both of the benefics are under the beams, right? And she's having a great contrast between the success she's having externally and also the inner turmoil that's beginning to, kind of take away her own internal peace by, her drug addiction that was really ramping up at this time. All right, I'll do a few more. So Venus gives to the moon, or actually in between that, Venus gives over to Mars and Saturn. And guess what happened? For 4 years, she had a lull with no musical success. She released some singles that basically didn't get any musical or larger attraction by the public. And so we can see that, her ascendant ruler giving over to the malefics, she wasn't as active or successful publicly, right? And then when Venus finally gave over to the moon, who is the ruler of her midheaven, she had her first successful single, Tell Mama, after several years of inactivity. She also had a follow-up single in that period, which was a success, which proved that she had the power to sustain her topping, of the charts. And then in the last period, when Venus gives over to Mercury, she marries and becomes a mother. And we know Venus is in her 5th. Critidemus says when Venus hands over to Mercury in Decennials, it's a favorable period, cheerful, pleasant, good for children, pleasing for women. So we see that brought about its natural significations very clearly. Then she entered her sun decade in pretty much most of the 70s, which, again, we see a massive lull in her career here. She was struggling with legal battles, with her addiction. The sun is in its exile in Aquarius in the 5th house. And so that's sort of where we see that manifest lack of career success and creative output that she had in other decades here. And when the sun transmitted to Saturn, when she was 35, 36, and 37, that was when she was simultaneously arrested for the possession of heroin and then brought into a 17-month rehab isolation period, right? And so again, we see that was also the termination of her contract with Chess Records, and Saturn basically took over those great opportunities that the sun gifted and brought her into that isolation space of the rehabilitation, which unfortunately didn't end up totally aiding her. But she did, or Hephaestion says, when sun gives to Saturn, by night, it brings dangers and inactivity, the cooling of things, judgments, bankruptcies, sufferings, etc. And then when the Jupiter decade started next, she was back at it, making music again. Oh, sorry, could you advance it, Chris, please? Thank you. Oh, that's right. I had another slide with the transits here. So again, this is a transit for that sun decade I was just talking about. And what happened was at the time that decade began, Mars was exactly on top of that stellium of planets of Venus, Jupiter, and the sun, right? So that's going to really corrupt her ability to use those benefics to good use for the 10 years that the sun ruled, especially since the sun is the time ruler and the malefic is damaging it for those 10 years in the transits. Additionally, there's that balsamic moon in Scorpio in her 2nd house and the financial troubles and all of the rest. And then we can move on to the Jupiter decade. So this was in the 80s. She was back at it making music again. She actually emerged right as the Jupiter period kicked in with another lead single that had great success. And then we can move forward to the Saturn decade, which followed that. Or the Mars decade she had here in the 90s, as you can see. I didn't bring any too notable events from there, but you can move forward. Saturn took over her last decade, decade 7. And it was right at the onset of this decade, in the Saturn period, that she basically began to have really severe health problems that arose. She had a gastric bypass surgery. Her immobility in her knees became a major problem for her. And then when Saturn gave over to the Sun, there was all these issues about her estate, right? Which is a classic issue with Saturn, especially as the ruler of her fourth house. And so her children were in legal battles with her ex-husband about where the goods of her estate would go. And Critodema says when Saturn gives to the Sun, it's lawsuits related to lands, dangers to the father, losses, unfavorable period in general. So again, we see that kicking in really clearly. And the last period I'll mention is the Saturn-Mars. So the very last planetary period she saw, the 49th, she lived through all 7 decades, all 7 subperiods. It was Saturn-Mars that partnered at the time of her death, at the end of her life. And so we can see how, again, this malefic combination was strong enough to unfortunately cause her demise in the end of her life. And yeah, that was all I had. Thank you guys all for traveling along for the ride. Oh, and for fun, those are the transits at the onset of the Saturn-Mars subperiod specifically, with the south node on her meridian. Yeah, there's a lot you could talk about, but we'll leave it at that.
All right, it's my turn. I'm going to speak on profections. What are profections? Glad I kept this short. Profections, that word is coming out of Latin. It's coming out of the Latin word proficio, which means to advance, which is the Greek, which is an attempt to capture the meaning of the Greek word aphasis, which is letting go or releasing. You'll notice releasing is a word you've heard of. Technically, all Time Lord procedures are forms of releasing. What are we releasing? We're releasing tension. What is the tension? The tension is the natal chart, the promise of the life to come for a particular person. The chart in itself has its particular determinations. This planet's determined to provide a spouse, this, a career, this, the health or the illness, what have you. But they're all held in tension because the natal chart occurring somewhat outside of time, something akin to the eternal, if such a thing is. There's still, there are potentialities. There are things that are probably going to happen, even delineation is itself a form of prediction. So we hold these things, they are held by the natal chart, and as all the Time Lord procedures progress, as they go through the various periods of time, all the tension becomes released. It's like a string being plucked. There's something of an analogy of any musical instrument. I think one thing in particular that comes to mind is from this period of time, the Pythagoreans had this musical instrument called a monochord, which was literally a string on a piece of wood tied to 2 screws or whatever, and they would use it not so much to make music, but it was almost like a sort of meditative guide for them to determine the sounds of ratio, the sounds of number. But then again, any musical instrument that involves tension and release, guitars is another example that comes to mind, or harps or what have you. So we release these tensions through all the various techniques. And Profections does it in its own way. It is primarily a sign-based technique. We're really focused on the sign. We move planets, other astrologicals like the ascendant or lots or what have you through the signs, almost in like some game of Parcheesi or Monopoly, assigning some period of time to a sign. It could be for a year, which is usually where we start, and where I will probably keep this presentation to. But they can also be months and days. Conceptually, you can keep extending them to hours if you wanted to, or even less, even smaller units of time. But at that point, that seems kind of a little much, but good if you want to. As the planets enter other signs, they are handing off their natal determined responsibilities to these, to these new signs. So any planets that are in that sign They may pick up the slack for whatever it is that natal planet is supposed to be doing for the life. If there's no planet in there, it's going to be the domicile lord. There are some other various rules. We can get into that later. Let me have the next slide. We're going to go and do some laborious Greek. This is a translation of part of Paulus by Levente Laszlo, which is as of yet unpublished publicly. I think it's only on his Patreon. And then we'll decipher this into some more reasonable English afterwards. For the sake of an example, for finding the year, we're specifically looking for a yearly perfection here. Someone who has the lion as his hour marker, Leo rising, is living his 26th year. So he's 25 years old. Because again, they're using cardinal numbers, not ordinal. The other way around. I forget at the moment. We give the first year to the hour marker, which is the line. The second one to the one succeedent of the hour marker, which is the Virgin. That would be the second house, second sign. And the third one to the balance, Libra. The fourth one to the Scorpion. The fifth one in order to the Archer. That would be Sagittarius. The sixth one to the goat horn one, Capricorn. The seventh one to the water pourer, Aquarius. The eighth one to the fishes, Pisces. The ninth one to the ram, Aries. The 10th to the bull, Taurus. The 11th one to the twins, Gemini. And the 12th one to the crab, Cancer. As the set of the 12 signs has been completed, we begin counting once again, and then we give the 13th year, which is when a person would turn age 12, using our counting. That would be their 13th year of life. If we go back to the hour marker, which is the lion, the 14th one to the Virgin, and similarly, the next years to the corresponding signs until number 12 has been completed. Then we give the 25th year, when they turn 24, to the hour marker, start this cycle yet again, and the 26th year falls to the Virgin. So basically, this person turned 25, so the yearly perfection is in Virgo. Now, the next slide, please. In simpler language, for a yearly perfection, we start with one sign per year. We start with the ascendant. At the beginning of their life, when they're just born, their perfected signs are, in fact, the same signs as their natal chart. So we don't have to do any jumping. As soon as they turn 1, their second year of life, we move one sign forward. So now the ascendant has moved to the second sign, to whatever the second house is. If the previous example, it was a Leo rising, now he's a Virgo rising for this particular year. Third year of life, when they turn age 2, jump to the next sign. That would be Libra, using the previous example. And then we keep going. And then every 12 years, well, by the time the person turns age 12, we've gone through the entire zodiac, and we're back again at the ascendant. And then we go again and again and again. So at age 12, at age 24, 36, 48, we're always starting with what the natal chart already has. And then we progress forward. And that's sort of your quick mnemonic of trying to figure out how to calculate things. So people who are aged, let's see, 12, 11, 10, people who are age 9, that's, has moved to the 10th sign, has moved to usually where their midheaven is. So when someone's 9, or they're 21, or they're 33, or they're 45, these are always 10th sign years. I hesitate to use house because the house consideration is not the primary thing, although it is a thematic thing to take note of, but you want to think in terms of signs for this. Some additional material. Months and days, we also follow the same procedure, jumping around for each month or each day, starting from wherever we are at the yearly perfection. So if we had perfected to, from Leo to Virgo, Virgo being the sign for the year is also the sign for the first month. Once we get to the next month, we jump to Libra, but we're still in the yearly Virgo perfection. And then we jump for every month of the 12, we jump one sign until we get back to, the 12th. The 12th one would be Leo, and then 13th one, okay, that's the next year. We jump in a year for the next sign, Libra, and then we go around again. it's a bit of math. Adding in some other material, Valens will say you can perfect everything, perfect all the planets. You don't have to stick with the ascendant. You can use the lots. You can use whatever you have. He recommends that. That gets things very, very complicated very quickly. Planets hand over matters to the planets in the signs that they land in, as I mentioned before. So if you had, let's say, some Leo who had the moon in Leo, when the moon jumps into Virgo, the moon also would come along as well as the ascendant would, and the moon would transfer its matters to Mercury, just as the ascendant would. So if the moon was handling someone's Leo ascendant, their moon was the 12th house. So the 12th house would have to do with, enemies and undoing and so forth. So it could be that now, the people who they have inimical relationships with have a mercurial bent. They'll be, maybe they'll be intelligent, or they'll be very talkative, argumentative. Maybe they'll be lawyers. Maybe they'll have lawyer problems, things like that. If there's a planet in that sign, that planet will actually snatch the meaning of whatever the natal planet is from them, as opposed to the domicile lord. Domicile lord is sort of like you're the last one standing. There's a planet in there. The planet's going to jump in and take matters to its own hand, and manipulate events according to its own nature and its own sort of disposition in the chart. This gets very complicated. We're not going to do all this. Valens also wants to throw in a thing about planets that are transiting in that sign. He wants to have them jump in there and also take rulership if the planet is, if the sign is empty. I don't know if I'd do that, but it is in the tradition. So I think for our simplicity's sake, and for the example that we're going to use for James, we're just going to keep it simple. We're going to look at the ascendant. We're going to look at the light of the sect of the chart, which for her is the moon. And then we're going to look at the lot of fortune. So let me have the next slide. Now, the one event I decided to focus on is this album At Last, because this is the album she's known for. It was her debut album. It is probably the best known work that she's done. It brought her out in the scene. It was like a big deal. And so for this particular year, which is when she turned 22, the ascendant had perfected to Leo from Libra. The moon and fortune, which are both in Sagittarius in the natal chart, they themselves perfected to the ascendant sign, Libra. So in order to explain what that means, we'll start with the ascendant. Now, the ascendant is generally going to be the person in general. Sometimes the body, but primarily the mind and like what's going on with them as a person in general. Being brought to a Leo sign that involves, that is empty in the chart. This involves, well, it's empty except for the lot of spirit, but I'll do that later. Basically now, she was sort of brought to the rulership of the sun. The sun is going to be predominant in her life for that year. What does the sun symbolize? Recognition. She's going to be recognized for something. She's going to have maybe some element of fame. She's going to have some element of power, like she'll be able to demonstrate her abilities in the world. What does the sun do? Now, part of it's like we have to see what the sun is doing natally. What is it doing natally? Number one, it's in the 5th. It involves creativity in general. It could be children, but we know from the facts of life that this is her creating this album, doing this performance, doing this great sort of recorded performance. Another thing we can add in there, a lot of diamond, a lot of spirit is in there. This is tied into the sort of volition of Etta James in the world. Like, what did she want to do? Like, this is a thing that she wanted to do. Clearly, is to make something. To become famous, I think, is to become noticed, to become recognized. These are, somewhat common motivations, but for some they're much stronger than others. And I think this is sort of an example of how powerful it is for her. Like she jumped at this opportunity. Other things we can tie into this, the sun being in a Aquarian sign, well, sun being also with a bunch of other planets, Venus and Jupiter. Venus and Jupiter, okay, are bringing in an element of collaboration. And this work was also a work of great collaboration. I think it was the Chess Brothers, who own the record label, saw her and like saw her talent, and then they were like, okay, we would definitely want to get involved in this. And then, you know, it became a thing. It became like a big thing where she was supported by all these, powerful and sort of generous people to get this thing done, right? Another thing we can take note of when we do a perfection is that we want to see all the planets that aspect the perfected sign. So when we're looking at Leo, we note that in the natal chart, the moon, Venus, Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn all cast, they all cast rays into Leo. Mars and Mercury don't, and maybe for her that was probably a good thing. But they're all going to add, their bit to what goes on in life. They're going to contribute to the events of the life. And generally, this is very copacetic because it also ties into some of the other perfections. But in general, okay, the moon, it's going to be, something's going to be publicly known. She's going to communicate. She's going to be known sort of widely, She's going to be known for her ability to communicate. And in this particular matter, it's about, music, right? People are actually going to get to hear her voice. Sun, we've already kind of sort of covered that. Jupiter and Venus, that's also this idea of creating art and being supported by, wealthy people. Saturn, we know that, Etta James had a very troubled life, and I'm sure that is another thing that sort of came in and contributed to what was going on. Mercifully, it didn't take center stage, but it was probably in there. We go to the other perfections for this thing. We have the moon and fortune to Libra. Now, another thing that I have to throw in is that depending on what place a perfection is landing in, it has a general sort of thematic element of whether it benefits the life or not. If a perfection is to a good place, which is generally the signs that aspect the ascendant. So that would be basically the 11th, the 10th, the 9th, the 7th, the 5th, the 4th, 3rd. Sometimes a second because it's rising after that gets thrown in as a good place, but that's a debate among various authors. But generally, if a perfection lands in a good place, that's generally going to be, okay, this is a year where some sort of things that occur that are beneficial for the native. Likewise, if they land in a bad place, in general, meaning the 6th, 8th, and 12th, those are going to be years that are going to be troublesome. Now, conveniently for her, this year, everything seems to land in a good place. Everything lands either in the 11th, which is great, or the 1st, which is, again, the primary good place, the place that embodies the individual in the first place. And it's the moon and fortune. So we're talking about, again, some great material benefit. Fortune is going to bring just very, simply put, very good luck, And for her, this is like, this was a very tremendous a feat in her career. The moon, being the natal ruler of the 10th of the career in general, landing in the 1st, also brings to mind, okay, we're going to have a very profound moment for what this person does in the world. And also, taking a detour to like the monthly perfections, by the time the actual the single of At Last comes out is basically the January of the following year, which is like, well, right, still before the birthday, so it's still that 11th sign year. So that again accentuates the idea of like this is a big career moment for her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gabe. And thank you, Larry, Chris, Cameron, and Gabriel again. Absolutely outstanding presentations. Thank you so much for giving your wisdom and insights. Absolutely wonderful. Do you have time for a quick couple of questions? I know we're near time, but I think we can give Saturn a day off and extend these wonderful presentations. So are you ready for a couple of questions? And I think first, I think this pertains to Chris, the first two questions. So one of the questions was, what is the author of the book mentioned by Chris about the synodic periods?
Oh, I'm so sorry that I wasn't clear. It's Vedius Valen's anthology, particularly book 7. So Mark Riley has a translation that's free on the internet. You can get the PDF. Chris Brennan has lovingly published a book that has the chart examples in it. Riley's translation originally did not. There's also the Project Hindsight Robert Schmidt translation that is maybe somewhere if you can get your hands on it. But those are the two most popular translations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And I think this was a question directed to you. Does it matter what degree of the ascendant sign one is born in for this technique? I'm not sure. I think it might have been during your presentation.
That is a great question. So technically, no, but insofar as when you're interpreting the rising of the signs, the ascensional time of the signs, you do want to know what house that sign is related to so that you can find some meanings in the topics of that house. So it's kind of tied up in it. You might be able to do some things to maybe do a little bit of rectification with it. But yeah, the idea that you need a little bit of information about the house itself.
Well, thank you again. And I'm not sure who this question was directed to, but we have a question here if anyone would like to answer. If one lives to the age of 90 plus, I assume that the 10-year, 9-month cycle begins again.
Yeah, that one basically after the first 7 decades are completed, it resets to the original initiator of the whole cycle. So it would go back to the moon in her case for the 8th decade.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cameron. And lastly, how do you know what time length planets get?
I think that one is also about decennials.
So in that case, you are basically just like we talked about, it's using the same numbers as the years, but applying it in months instead of years. So it's the same numbers that we are looking at with periods and ZR just in months. There are smaller levels that are all still proportionate, which use the percentages that I included on an earlier slide. But yeah, it's all based on the minor periods of the planets. I hope that helps answer.
Thank you, Cameron. And again, thank you all so much. Absolutely outstanding presentations.